This past summer, first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to come. This has been a really stimulating conference. I've really enjoyed it very much so far. This past summer, I was invited by James Gilmore, the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Oral History Archives, to summarize a collection of Hebrew interviews that had been sitting untranslated in the museum archives since the museum's founding in 1993. There are 14 interviews in the collection conducted in Israel between October 4th and October 28th, 1987, with surviving members of the Cracow Ghetto underground. The interviews were conducted by Eliyahu Pfefferkorn, a survivor himself, who resided in both Israel and Canada after the war and was the author of the award-winning memoir, The Musulman at the Water Cooler, which was published in 2012, and co-editor of the English version of Justina's Narrative by Gusta Davidson Dranger, which came out in English in 1996, a text that will figure prominently in the course of our discussion today. Upon completion, the interviews Pfefferkorn conducted were donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, established in 1980 as the precursor to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Pfefferkorn apparently was a close confidant of Elie Wiesel when the latter was the chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Pfefferkorn passed away in 2017. From a formal perspective, in the Cracow Ghetto Underground Project interviews, we never hear the interviewers' questions and are therefore hard-pressed to consider what has been asked of the interviewee. My assessment of the line of questioning, based on the answers provided by the interviews, is that Pfefferkorn is trying to verify many of the details from Gusta Davidson Dranger's diary written between January and April 1943 while she was imprisoned in Montelupich prison in Krakow, and subsequently published in Polish in 1946, in Hebrew in 1974, and in English in 1996. So that's Davidson. This is the Polish version of her diary, the Hebrew, and the English. Pfefferkorn, it seems to me, is asking for information about the main figures discussed in the diary, primarily Shimmick Dranger, Gusta's husband, Gusta Davidson Dranger herself, and Dolik Libeskind. All three were leaders of the Agudat HaNoar HaIvri Akiva, or the Akiva youth movement in Krakow, and its wartime outgrowth, Hechalutz HaLochem, or the Fighting Pioneer. All three were killed during the war. Rather than focusing on his interviewers' experiences as living survivors, Pfefferkorn seems to have asked the living to give voice to the dead. Dory Laub, in his psychoanalytic model for the collection of testimonies at the Fortunoff Archives at Yale, presents a scenario wherein, through the process of being interviewed, the survivor of the Holocaust relives his or her trauma, opening a door for catharsis and healing that for many can't take place until the story of the trauma is talked through, like Freud's talking cure writ large. The Cracow Ghetto Uprising interviews, needless to say, are not in any way committed to that kind of process, as their goal is not centered on the story of the survivor being interviewed, but on the story of victims who cannot be interviewed because they are no longer alive. There is a strangely mercenary quality to these interviews because the stories that are recorded are by and large only stories that pertain to the survivor's ability to provide information about the dead. What I would like to consider here with you today is how one of these survivors, specifically Elsa Lapa, or Shifra Lustgarten, as she came to be known in Israel after the war, defies these parameters in order to tell a story that is uniquely her own, thus illustrating important directions, to my mind, for the future of Holocaust testimony, theoretically and pedagogically. She negotiates the collective story of her peer group of ghetto fighters in Krakow alongside her own personal story in order to model for us, I argue, new ways to tell the story of East European Zionist youth movements through the lens of video testimonials about the Holocaust. I hope in the course of this paper to discuss the way in which, in a post-Zionist and even an anti-Zionist moment in America, the story of East European Zionism and its role in resistance during the war can exemplify some of the tensions between communal and individual survival as told by one survivor. Zionism as a nationalist movement, like all nationalist movements, has fallen out of favor in academic circles because of its commitment to communal ideologies in a historically unprecedented moment of individualism. It is not my intention to teach my students in America that Zionism is anything but nationalistic. However, in encountering the Zionism expressed in the Cracow Ghetto underground interviews, it occurred to me that these interviews provide a unique perspective on the promise of Zionism for individuals in a moment of darkness. By teasing out the individual voices in these interviews, voices that defy the explicit purpose of the interviews, which is to get a better perspective on the leaders of the movement, it is also possible, I believe, to tease out a Zionist narrative that defies the popular perception of Zionism as inherently yoked to the contemporary political state of Israel. Rather, in the context of these interviews, Zionism can be taught as an articulation of something far more complex and nuanced than the image of a colonialist, wholly communal power that dominates American discourse about it today. Even in relation to a collectivist impulse in the gathering of certain types of Holocaust testimonies, such as those represented in the Cracow collection I am currently working with, Shifra Lustgarten's or Elsa Lapa's video testimony demonstrates the necessity to read the individual between the lines of the collective, to read the personal between the lines of the ideological, and helps us to illustrate the particular role played by Zionism within the ghettos and the camps. I'm hoping in this reading of Lustgarten's testimony within the context of other related texts and testimonies to model a literary way of reading for cultural history that doesn't obliterate the story of individuals. The story of the Cracow Ghetto Underground is most familiar to popular readers because of the publication of Davidson Dranger's Prison Diary. Gusta was a leader of Akiva, not to be confused with B'nai Akiva, a youth movement of the general Zionists primarily active in western Galicia and extremely popular in the Cracow region. Akiva was known for its ideology of intense communality, its commitment to youth education, the warmth of its leaders towards its young participants, and its passionate pursuit of the value of chalutziyut, or a pioneering spirit. In a 1932 manifesto on the values of the movement, published in the movement journal Divrei Akiva, we read, quote, "There are some movements that wouldn't dare to tread on unpaved paths. The pioneering spirit means that you have to number yourself among the conquerors and the pavers, to bear the burden that other people won't bear, and to lead the way for the nation to follow behind." In these interviews, it becomes apparent that this singularity of this vision, of youth becoming leaders of the nation, fueled the notion of Jewish resistance in the ghettos, but also allowed room for articulation of individual potential and individual experience. For purposes of our discussion, I'd like to focus on the intersections between Gusta's book-length written narrative and a video interview with Elsa Lapa Lustgarten conducted in October 1987 by Eli Pfefferkorn and archived at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'd like to demonstrate, through an exploration of the intersection between these testimonial documents, I'd like to demonstrate the ways in which studying oral histories enables us to escape the bonds of the dead speaking for the living and the living speaking for the dead, and allowing the living to speak for themselves. In the course of this discussion, I would like, as it were, to correct some of the wrongs I perceived in the way that the interviews were conducted in 1987 for the United States Holocaust Memorial Council in asking survivors to speak exclusively about the dead, instead of using the interview situation as an opportunity to explore the experience of survival. Finally, I hope to reflect on the uses of Holocaust testimonies such as the ones in the Cracow Underground collection to teach in the United States a history of Zionism during a profoundly anti-Zionist moment. Elsa Lapa Lustgarten was one of the youngest members of Hasharon, the Cracow Akiva branch run by Shimik Dranger and Dolek Libeskind. Alongside her husband-to-be, Shimik Lustgarten, Elsa Lapa was involved in a number of different missions for Hechalutz Halochem, including the attempted assassination of Spitz, a member of the Judenrat, and picking up the pieces after the central mission of Hechalutz Halochem, the Siganeria Cafe attack on December 22, 1942, in which approximately 20 Germans were killed and the Polish resistance was put on high alert. So this is a picture of some of the key players of the Hechalutz Halochem. Wait, why is that there? After the deportation of Shimmick Lustgarten's parents to Belzec in 1942, their apartment at 13 Yosefinska Street became the headquarters for Hechalutz Halochem, with, according to Gusta in her memoir, Elsa playing the role of mother to the newly orphaned community of teenagers and young adults, while Shimmick Lustgarten played the role of the father. Elsa Lapa is mentioned only briefly in Justina's narrative, first as the person who accompanied Gusta's mother out of the ghetto before a major deportation, then as the mistress of ceremonies at 13 Yosefinska Street. In her discussion of Yosefinska Street, we read this description of Elsa. Elsa was always in the kitchen, busy at the stove. She cooked, managed, ruled, and complained without end. She reminded everyone of a harried mother hen for whom nothing seemed to go right. The coals hadn't been cut, the water hadn't been fetched, or else the fire refused to burn properly. And then the ungrateful youngsters would form a tight ring around the oven, put their hands on their hips, and poke fun at the angry mother hen. Unable to sustain her anger, Elsa would burst into deep, throaty laughter. That healthy, rugged girl could really laugh. Everything about Elsa was hearty, her laughter, her tears, her sadness, her happiness. She was an elemental, high-spirited character. When she tackled a problem, she did it with such abandon that she seemed to lose her capacity to distinguish the essential from the trivial. She would go on about minor details with such intense emotion that they would appear to be matters of life and death. But as soon as she resolved the problem, she would be completely happy again. Her healthy good humor would burst to the surface, and her laughter would ring through that long corridor. Beneath that effervescent demeanor lay a truly contagious soul. When she wanted to help someone, she could move mountains, and she was always ready to help anyone in need. At the moment, she had dedicated her life and soul to the kitchen at Yosefinska 13. She believed that the survival of the universe depended on her kitchen management, so when the young ones surrounded her at the stove and mocked her single-mindedness, she just knitted her brows, chased them out of the kitchen, and carried on with her housekeeping. When I first read this description of Elsa in Gusta's diary, I didn't even register that it was the same person whose oral narrative I had just translated. The whole emphasis was different. The Elsa described in Gusta's book is a mother. She's the energetic life and soul of a community of people, the glue that holds it all together, that nourishes it, nurtures it. However, the Elsa that emerges from her own oral testimony is an embattled child. So we're going to listen to just 3 very short clips.
ועליי לרגל אחרי שפיץ. אני לא רוצה לחזור על סיפור מי זה היה שפיץ. זה היה איש מאוד מאוד מסוכן עבורנו, ועליי היה לרגל מהבוקר עד הערב, אבל לא בגטו, חוץ מהגטו, בתור אישה כפרית, ולרשום לפניי כל צד וצד לאן הוא הולך מה. ולי באופן אישי כל כך עם חנכגה לא היה כזה קשר גדול. הייתי אחד מהשורה. אבל לבן לייבוביץ' לעתים קרובות היה בא אלינו ליוזפינסקה לראות איך, מה נשמע. כשב8 בבוקר הייתי צריכה לצאת אחרי שפיץ לרגל, במצב כלכלי שלנו היה קטסטרופלי. ניגשתי ללבן ואמרתי לו, תראה, אני אעשה מה שאתם רוצים ממני, רק בתנאי אחד. תן לי כמה זלוטי שאני אוכל לקנות לי איזה עוגה, מה שקומה טוב. אני באמת לפני מותי רוצה שמותי יהיה מתוק. אז באמת לבן צחק ואמר, מי יכול לעמוד נגד דרישות שלך? וחוציא את 20 זלוטיס ונתן לי, עם זה יצאתי. יום יום הייתי יוצאת.
So there's so much we can talk about just in terms of the picture that's standing right behind her. That's her husband, her late husband's picture, Shimmick Lustgarten, who was also a member of the resistance and who in his memoir barely mentions her, but her testimony is dedicated to him, and there's a picture of him right on top of her the whole time. Periodically, and we'll see it in one of the other clips, they sort of pan over to the books that are on the bookshelf next to her, and it says Toldot Eretz Israel, the history of Israel. So there's a very There's so many things one can say, one can do to analyze these clips, but we're going to just be focusing really on what she says for today. So in the excerpt we just saw, she talks about how she demanded some spare change from her commander, Laban, whose name was Avraham Leibovich. He was the leader of Dror, another Zionist youth group in Cracow that collaborated with Hechalutz Halochem, when she went out on her mission so that she could buy sweets. That way, she said, if she was killed in action, she could at least die with a sweet taste in her mouth. At another juncture, she bursts out in amazement at the fact that she was only 15 when she became a courier for the movement. 15, she cries, becoming animated and throwing up her arms. So we'll watch that briefly.
בטרנספורט מסבורשים, מי שראה ב-38 ידע שהיטלר החליט לגמור את היהדות. מי שראה את האנשים, אמהות, ילדים, ככה, הכל ערומים, בלי מכנסיים, בלי תחתונים. אז באמת הייתי בת 15 שהבאתי את המשפחה. אבל אתה יודע מה, אצלנו ב-15 הייתי כזו גדולה, 15. מאיתנו דרשו אנשי תנועה. אני לא יודעת, ב-15 אני לא יודעת. אני לא יכולה לתאר לאף אחד. אני מחפש, אולי אני אדבר בפולנית על שמק דרגר, כי אני מרגישה אבל הם לא יבינו, שהשפה שלי דלה בכדי לבטא את שמק דרגר.
So I kept that little final part because it really gives you a sense of what she was supposed to be talking about, right? She's supposed to be talking about Shemek Dranger. She's not supposed to be talking about herself, right? Here we see an interesting articulation, in the one we just saw, an interesting articulation of her youth during her time in Hechalutz Halochem, alongside a very ambivalent articulation of her precocity. In contrast to Gusta's depiction of her, Elsa here demonstrates her own profound awareness of how inappropriately mature she was forced to be, both by the war but also by the Tnu'ah, the Zionist youth group, Akiva. In a final example of the complexities of being both young and old at one and the same time, in the following clip we hear about Elsa's departure from the bosom of her family who had escaped Cracow to live in its outskirts in order for her to return to Cracow upon Shemek Dranger's request to work in the resistance. So we're going to watch that.
הצלחתי להעביר את המשפחה, אבא ואמא, ואחיותיי, חובלתי אותם עד שמצאתי, עד שגרמני, הלכתי ראשונה, חוצי נשק, בכדי לשאול מה נעשינו כאן. ניגשתי אליו, אמרתי, אתה רוצה, תן לי כדור, לא רוצה, אל תיתן, אבל אני רוצה רק להגיד לך משהו. תן לנו רק לעבור את הקטע הזה, ולא ראית אותנו ולא שמעת וזהו, וכך היה. מאז אמא משום מה חשבה שאני אהיה עזור, שאוכל תמיד את המשפחה להציל, ואני מביאה אותם לאיזה גוי, שמו היה צ'יקווה, והסכים שם את המשפחה שלי שייכנסו. ואז אני ניגשת לאמי ואומרת, את אינה אמא, את יודעת שיש לי שמץ בקרקוב, את יודעת שאהבתנו כל כך חזקה, תני לי ללכת, את אינה הייתי איתכם. אמי אמרה,
Here we see the way in which Elsa became her family's protector and then chose to leave them on their own in order to pursue her own youthful ideals of resistance. She moves from being her parents' parent, as it were, to acting on what may even be construed as childish enthusiasm for the movement's insurgency at her family's expense. Her emotions in the clip and the close-up on the book about the land of Israel behind her agonized body language, which I didn't show because I'm running out of time, tells the whole story in a much more complex way than Gusta ever could have done in her brief recounting of Elsa's maternal role on 13 Josefinska Street. With this close-up, we are reminded of the profoundly Zionist nature of Elsa's commitment, not only to Akiva, but also to Hachalutz Halochem, and we are brought to the present moment in which we hear Elsa speaking in her living room in Israel, in Hebrew, to an interviewer about those leaders of a Zionist youth movement who, while dying themselves, facilitated her survival. We will return to the Zionist subtext momentarily, and I really am almost done. Taken together, these two texts, Gusta's narrative and Elsa's oral interview, provide us with a good example of a kind of montage, both of Elsa's own experience, but also of the powerful impact of Zionism on the Cracow underground movement. Elsa's oral history navigates the personal and the collective, the historical and the particular, in important ways. By Gusta's account, Elsa was a mistress of ceremonies, a mother, a nurturer, a communal linchpin. By Elsa's own account, she was childlike, isolated, and lost. When considering the future of Holocaust testimony in light of this dialogue between testimonies, what we gain by being attentive to their overlaps as well as their differences is a sensitivity to the very relationship between the individual and the collective that Jeffrey Hartman alludes to in his reflection on the testimonies at the Fortunoff Archives at Yale. It has been said, he says, that testimony has both a private dimension, which is confessional and spiritual, and a public aspect, which is political and judicial. The word testimony itself links both meanings. Particularly within the context of a series of testimonies about a collective insurgency in the vacuum created by the breakdown of community and family, wherein the Nazi ideal was to break Jewish communities apart, turning individuals against one another in the struggle for subsistence, we get a clearer sense of the complicated dance of the individual and the collective that these testimonies bear. This, then, finally, is the point at which we return to the question of the future of these particular testimonies for pedagogical purpose in the U.S. As I began my work on this particular collection of testimonies by Israeli Holocaust survivors who participated in the Cracow Ghetto uprising, primarily as members of the Akiva youth group, I realized that during a moment in America when Zionism as a synecdoche for the contemporary state of Israel is a dirty word, it might be useful to draw on these testimonies to flesh out the role of Zionism within Jewish history, as articulated so eloquently by the aging voices of the survivors who found individual meaning and a means of surviving their trauma through their involvement with Zionism through Akiva. By focusing on the story of Zionism, and specifically of the Akiva movement in Cracow during the war, as narrated by Elsa and Gusta, with their complicated negotiations of the individual and the collective, the ideological and the emotional, the personal and the public, I believe that as a teacher in the American classroom during a profoundly anti-Zionist moment, I can aspire to remove the narrative of Zionism from the present political situation and explain it in terms of a Jewish narrative that spans far more than the modern state of Israel. By presenting Zionist narratives from within Israeli oral testimonies of the Holocaust, I think that it may be possible to teach Zionism in a post-Zionist and even an anti-Zionist moment, not as an exploration of history, but an exploration of the impulse and the impetus towards self-realization within modern Jewish narratives. Better understanding the structure and function of these testimonies can help us reclaim the Zionist narratives from a humanist perspective and not simply from a nationalistic one. Thank you.